He couldn't walk, couldn't speak, could barely breathe. His throat had been torn open by the bear's claws, and his back was so badly mauled that his exposed spine was visible through the wounds. His own men had looked at him, decided he was already dead, and left him alone in the wilderness, with nothing. No weapons, no food, no medicine. Just a man the frontier had already killed, who hadn't realized it yet. Hugh Glass didn't survive what happened next because he was the strongest man on the expedition. He survived because he was the angriest. It was 1823. The American frontier was one of the most dangerous places on Earth, a vast unmapped wilderness of mountains, rivers, and plains stretching west from the Mississippi. The fur trade was booming, and that meant one thing: men willing to go further into that wilderness than anyone had gone before. Hugh Glass was one of those men. In his late 40s, weathered and experienced, Glass had spent years on the frontier as a fur trapper and scout. He had survived things that had killed younger, stronger men. He had a reputation among the other trappers as someone who simply did not stop. Not in bad weather, not in hostile territory, not when common sense said, turn back. In the spring of 1823, Glass joined an expedition led by General William Henry Ashley, heading up the Missouri River and into the uncharted territory of present-day South Dakota. The expedition was large, over 100 men, experienced, well-armed, and pushing into territory controlled by the Arikara Nation, who had already attacked Ashley's men once that year. Glass knew the risks. He went anyway. It was the kind of decision that defined him, and it was about to cost him everything. August 1823. The expedition had split into smaller groups moving through the dense woodland along the Grand River. Glass was scouting ahead, alone, as he often preferred, when he came over a rise and walked directly into a grizzly bear and her 2 cubs. There was no time to run, no time to reload his rifle after the first shot. The bear was on him in seconds. 400 pounds of pure aggression defending her cubs. She bit through his neck, raked her claws across his back repeatedly, picked him up, and threw him. When he tried to crawl away, she dragged him back. The other men arrived at the sound of screaming and managed to drive the bear off, but not before she had done catastrophic damage. Glass was barely recognizable. His scalp had been partially torn from his skull. His throat was lacerated. His back was shredded to the bone in multiple places. One leg had been broken. The expedition's field assessment was brutal in its honesty. Hugh Glass was going to die. The only question was when. General Ashley made a decision. The expedition couldn't stop. The Arikara were close, and a stationary group was a dead group. He asked for 2 volunteers to stay with Glass until he died, give him a proper burial, then catch up with the main party. 2 men stepped forward. John Fitzgerald, experienced, pragmatic, and primarily motivated by the money Ashley offered, and a teenager named Jim Bridger, young, inexperienced, and not yet sure what kind of man he was going to be. They waited. Glass didn't die. Days passed. Glass remained unconscious, but breathing. Barely, but breathing. Fitzgerald grew increasingly agitated. The Arikara were close. Every day they stayed was another day of risk for 2 men sitting in the open with an unconscious companion who showed no signs of dying quickly. On the 5th day, Fitzgerald made his decision. He took Glass's rifle, his knife, and his supplies. Told Bridger they were leaving. Bridger, 17 years old, alone on the frontier with a man twice his age, telling him what to do, went with him. They left Hugh Glass alive, alone, unarmed, in the wilderness, and Hugh Glass woke up. He had no way of knowing how long he had been unconscious, no way of knowing how far ahead the expedition was, no way of knowing exactly where he was. What he knew was this: his rifle was gone, his knife was gone, his food was gone. He had open wounds across his back that were already infected. He could smell them. His broken leg meant he couldn't stand. And the nearest American settlement, Fort Kiowa on the Missouri River, was approximately 200 miles away. He set his own broken leg, using sticks and strips torn from his clothing. He covered his wounds as best he could. He found a direction, southeast, toward the river, toward Fort Kiowa, and he started moving, not walking, crawling. He ate whatever he could find, wild berries, roots, insects. He found a buffalo calf that wolves had killed and drove the wolves off it with nothing but noise and desperation, eating the raw flesh to stay alive. He lowered himself into streams to let the cold water slow his infections. He navigated by the sun and stars, covering 2 or 3 miles on good days, barely moving on bad ones. The frontier tried to kill him every single day. Exposure, infection, starvation, hostile territory. Every morning he woke up and chose to keep moving, not because survival instinct demanded it, because somewhere ahead of him were 2 men who had taken everything he had and left him to die. That was enough. 6 weeks into the crawl, Glass reached the Cheyenne River. It was a turning point, not safety, not rescue, but progress. The river meant direction, water, and the possibility of finding other trappers or friendly tribes. He built a crude raft from driftwood. Hands that had been crawling through dirt and rock for 6 weeks, suddenly doing something constructive, something that required skill rather than just endurance. He floated downstream, covering in hours what would have taken days on land. A band of Lakota Sioux found him on the riverbank, half dead, barely human in appearance, wounds still open and infected. They could have killed him. Instead, they treated his wounds with medicinal plants, fed him, and eventually guided him toward the Missouri River and the direction of Fort Kiowa. Glass arrived at Fort Kiowa in the late autumn of 1823. He had covered 200 miles in approximately 6 weeks. He had done it with a broken leg, infected wounds, and no equipment whatsoever. The men at Fort Kiowa, who saw him arrive, said he didn't look like a man who had survived something. He looked like a man who had come back specifically to do something. At Fort Kiowa, Glass learned where Fitzgerald and Bridger were. Bridger was with a nearby expedition, close enough to reach within days. Fitzgerald had gone further, enlisted in the U.S. Army at Fort Atkinson, hundreds of miles away. Glass set out immediately for Bridger, found him, stood in front of the 17-year-old who had left him to die, and looked at him for a long time. Bridger was barely more than a boy, terrified, certain he was about to die for what he had done. Glass had crawled 200 miles on a broken leg, through infected wounds for this moment, had eaten raw buffalo, had driven wolves away with his bare hands, had navigated 200 miles of hostile frontier on nothing but rage and the promise of this confrontation. He let Bridger go, not because what Bridger did was acceptable, but because Glass looked at the frightened teenager in front of him and understood that Fitzgerald had been the one who made the decision. Bridger had been 17 years old and alone on the frontier, and had followed an older man's lead. Glass had been young once. He knew what that was. He told Bridger he was forgiven. Then he turned and started the journey to Fort Atkinson to find Fitzgerald. It took months. When he finally arrived and found Fitzgerald, now a U.S. Army soldier, he discovered that Army regulations prevented him from killing an enlisted man without facing execution himself. The confrontation he had crawled 200 miles for, survived infection and starvation for, driven wolves away with his bare hands for, was over before it began. Fitzgerald was untouchable, and Hugh Glass had nothing left to be angry at. He returned Fitzgerald's rifle, the one that had been stolen from him and somehow made its way back into Army possession. He looked at the man who had left him to die, and he walked away. What happened in that moment, what Glass felt, what he said, whether there were any last words between them, was never recorded. Glass didn't speak about it. The frontier didn't care about it. The Missouri River kept moving, and the wilderness kept growing, and Hugh Glass went back to trapping because it was the only life he knew. He continued working as a fur trapper and scout for another decade. He mentored younger trappers. He scouted for expeditions into territory that still had no maps. He was by all accounts a different man after the crawl, quieter, more deliberate, with a stillness that the men who worked with him found either reassuring or unsettling, depending on who you asked. In the winter of 1833, Hugh Glass was killed by Arikara warriors on the Yellowstone River. The same nation that had threatened the expedition a decade earlier. He died as he had lived, in the wilderness, pushing further than most men were willing to go. He was somewhere in his late 50s, old for a frontiersman, older still for a man who had been left for dead at 47, with his spine exposed and his throat torn open on the banks of the Grand River. He had outlived what killed him by 10 years, 200 miles, broken leg, exposed spine, no weapons, no food, no help. Hugh Glass crawled out of the wilderness on nothing but rage and the refusal to let two men be right about him. He forgave one of them. He faced the other. And then he went back to the only life he had ever wanted. He didn't survive because the wilderness showed him mercy. He survived because he was angrier than it was. Subscribe for a new story every single day. And watch this next. Because some men don't just survive. They come back. If you enjoy survival stories that feel impossible, but could be real, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.